welcome to Business Today Television. I'm Siddharth Zarabi, and with me is very well-known, noted economist Eswar Prasad of Cornell University in the United States of America. Mr. Prasad, welcome to India Today and the Business Today studio here. And it's clearly a bright, sunny sunshine that's behind us, and India continues to be one of the brightest spots in the global economy. But before we come to India, your sense on how the world economy is today. We are still on the top of 2024, and we've seen in the last 2-3 years that shocks and change have been the only constant. So how's the global economy looking like to you?
Certainly, there is a little bit of a mood of pessimism pervading the air here in Davos, the sense that there is a confluence of risks that might be holding back growth in the coming year. But actually, if you start looking at the numbers, the picture that emerges is a much more nuanced one. There are parts of the world, the US in particular, which seems to be in much better shape in 2024 than we had anticipated just a few months ago. It looks like the economy might be able to accomplish this proverbial soft landing. The labor market remains strong, the economy remains strong, inflation is coming down. So in fact, the US might be able to power through without a recession, even a soft recession. That's not assured yet, but it's possible. China is certainly slowing down, but there too the signals have been quite mixed in the last few weeks. There are some indicators that the economy is stabilizing, but there are still some significant risks, especially related to the property sector. But by and large, it looks like China can put in about 5% growth in this year at least. If we start looking beyond those two countries, so the picture that emerges, especially here in Europe, is a somewhat more pessimistic one. The Eurozone, particularly some of the core economies like Germany, are not doing so well. And then, of course, there is a bright spot of India, which is likely in 2024 and perhaps even in 2025 to remain the largest growing major economy in the world. So it's a very mixed picture right now, with some economies holding up quite well, some looking a little weaker.
And the IMF has just told us a little while back that they will be revising upwards their forecast for the Indian economy, joining many others, including domestic agencies who have done that. But what would the kind of scenario that you held out for the United States of America mean for capital flows, especially into economies like India? The US still remains the largest source of global capital and drives growth. So if the US sneezes, many other markets catch a cold.
Here again, the picture is quite nuanced because it looks highly unlikely that we will see any more interest rate increases from the Fed in terms of the short-term policy rates. But in terms of when they might start cutting rates, how much they might cut rates in the next a year or so, it's far from clear at this stage, because the battle on inflation seems to have been won, but the Fed is certainly concerned about declaring victory prematurely, and it doesn't want to create the expectations that there are very significant interest rate cuts coming. What is even more important for a country like India or for the global capital markets is what happens to long-term rates. And that's a slightly more complex picture, because even if the Fed does cut short-term rates, the fiscal policy situation in the US is quite mixed still. We might have a lot more volatility in terms of fiscal policy making. Debt levels continue to rise, and no matter what happens in terms of fiscal policy making, chances are that there won't be much fiscal discipline. So that could keep long-term rates higher, especially if that comes with a dose of increased inflation expectations into the future. But I suspect that the notion that the US is not going to be hiking rates anymore is going to start leading to some capital flowing out of the country. But there is one more aspect of nuance here, which is that US equity markets have been doing remarkably well over the last year. So it's not going to be easy for investors to take money out of that very well-performing market and put it even into a market such as India, where the economy is performing perfectly well, but where the financial markets might be seen as somewhat more risky than in the US.
Well, valuations are a bit of a concern in India, because certain valuations are extremely high. But the fact is that retail investors in India have also stepped up when other institutional investors exited. So the Indian stock market has also seen a fundamental change. Coming back to the point of inflation, some of the key drivers of inflation were supply side shocks and what happened in China. Do you see a new equilibrium emerging in the supply side position all across the world, barring one-offs like incidents that keep happening? Is there a new equilibrium? Because countries like India have sought to benefit from it to set up domestic manufacturing and build up their own Atmanirbhar capacities.
No, on the inflation front, it's a little unclear at this stage. I mean, a couple of years ago, it seemed like we'd settled into a low inflation environment, but that certainly got disrupted by COVID and many of the other supply side shocks. But it does seem like inflation is coming under control because, as you mentioned, the supply side factors are going away. But it was never entirely clear how much of the increase in inflation we saw in the post-COVID recovery period was due to supply versus demand factors, because we did see a lot of policy measures that could have boosted demand. Now, some of those policies, especially fiscal policy measures, are fading away. So perhaps we can look forward to a world of lower inflation. Now, there are a variety of risks out there, including geopolitical risks in the Middle East that could drive up fuel prices, oil prices more broadly, and that could have an impact on inflation. And I don't think we've seen the end of supply disruptions. Now, in terms of the broader issues, in terms of what is happening in terms of what the IMF calls geoeconomic fragmentation, the notion that we are beginning to see trade flows and also capital flows fall along geopolitical lines rather than based purely on economic and efficiency considerations. India is certainly well positioned to take care of those benefits. So if you think of either financial flows into equity markets or foreign direct investment, in principle, India is very well positioned because India is on the right side of the geopolitical divide. It is seen as a dynamic economy with very good growth prospects. The long-term fundamentals are potentially sound. Demographics are working in our favor. So all of those is potentially going to pull capital India. And I keep saying the word potentially because it is going to take some work on the domestic front in terms of policy measures that can reassure foreign investors that it is going to be a business-friendly environment, that the institutional framework is going to remain strong, and that the policies are really going to provide stability that foreign investors are looking for.
2024 is going to be a very interesting year, not just for all the factors that you have pointed out, but also on account of elections. Many countries will go to the polls this year, the United States being one, India being another. In the US context, is that a risk that you would add to the mix?
It certainly creates a lot of volatility in terms of expectations about what policies we might have, because the two parties clearly have very, very different policies that they're going to put in place, whatever the new administration looks like. And there are other issues that have relevance not just for the US, but for the world at large. Take the US-China tensions. What happens there, whether the new administration or a continuation of the present administration, whether that tries to tamp down the tensions that have bubbled up to the surface on that front, will have implications again, not just for the US and China, but for the rest of the world. What sort of position the US takes in terms of its engagement with the rest of the world, especially in terms of trade policies, is again going to be hugely determined by what happens in the election. So I think November 2024 is something that is of great interest to the US and to the world at large. The world could look very different come January 2025.
And May 2024 will also be of great consequence within India. One final question. Over the last 3 decades, we grew up in college, in university, studying, and then professionally looking at the world trade order and a new way. That somehow seems to have splintered. Many aspects of what was considered the framework are dead. And you alluded to that, more bilateral, more regional trade based on self-interest. If I were to ask you, what is the new trade order, if at all, if you agree with that question, looking like? Can you sort of sketch it out for us, how it would look like in down the line?
It's not just the trade order, but the overall multilateral framework that is coming into question. And there is an issue here about what a new economic order might look like. I mean, there is a notion that we are moving away from a unipolar world where the US or the West dominates to a different one. But one interesting issue is that while economic power has certainly shifted towards emerging market economies, with China and India leading the way, financial power has really not shifted that much. If you think about not just financial market size and depth, but also the power of currencies, the US dollar still remains dominant. and it's going to be unlikely that that dominance is going to be shaken anytime soon.
Nobody is replacing that anytime soon.
Yeah, and there are fundamental reasons why the institutional framework of the US still holds together and still retains the trust of investors. So what I worry about is a world where actually you might have differences in these aspects of trade versus finance versus economic power that could create a lot more tension. If you think about economics, it seemed to be a sort of binding force because there was a sense that even competitors like the US and China could work together with their shared interests. Geopolitics, of course, is a zero-sum game. One country gains influence at the expense of another. The two were balancing each other to some extent, but now even economics is being seen as a zero-sum game. And that, I think, poses some real threats to the broader multilateral order. And I think we need a multilateral order because without rules of the game being well identified, I think countries are going to retreat to their own corners, looking after self-interest or looking at regional alliances. And I think this is not going to be good for the world at large, either in terms of stability or in terms of economic progress.
Anything in the near term that would reverse this?
So certainly if we have, wise leaders who can see beyond the narrow interests of the short-term moment and think about what is necessary in order to generate longer-term prosperity for their countries and see elements of shared prosperity, that is certainly important. And I think what India did at the G20 last year was very useful in finding areas of agreement. There are certainly areas where countries at the moment are not going to find it easy to agree. But at least in areas like climate change where countries can agree, if we can start moving forward, that I think creates a foundation for the world at large to start working together.
Eswar Prasad, it's been absolutely brilliant to hear your views here live on Business Today television. That was a comprehensive and crisp summary of some of the key economic issues for the world and India. Thank you very much once again, sir. And you, the viewer, if you've been, thank you very much for watching. We'll be back with more. Until then, do stay tuned in. Bye-bye.
Darwin Platform Group of Companies is one of the fastest growing diversified Indian conglomerates with global footprints. It is setting up offices globally and tying up with companies across the globe for multiple sectors. The company has ventured into real estate and construction, stockbroking and finance, arms and ammunition, mining, airlines, and many other sectors.